in the meeting. Anyway, my name's Steve Davis. I'm past president of PPMA. I'm currently the treasurer for the PPMA. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our next session, which is professional identity. And Dr. Fiona Chatton is going to take us through this session, helping us with achieving what our professional identity is, giving a sense of belonging, and being cognizant of psychological safety as well at the same time. I'll let Fiona introduce herself, because I'm sure she can do a lot better job in terms of her career history and that than I can. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Fiona. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Steve. Really nice to be here and nice to virtually meet you all. I'm going to attempt to share my screen now, and we're going to have a chat through about professional identity. Just bear with me a second. I'm just getting used to Zoom and how it works. So do you want to just give me the thumbs up? I'm hoping that's sharing okay with you all. Fabulous. Superb. Excellent. So thanks for inviting me on. Like I said, I'm going to come and talk to you about professional identity, and have a bit of a think through really about what professional identity is and how it helps us flourish in our roles. And you might be thinking, well, how is this relevant? What does this mean to me? So hopefully by the end of it, it will make a bit more sense to you. So who am I? Good question. I'll be asking you that in a second as well. So mostly I'm a mum, stepmom of 3 teenagers. I think that's probably the busiest and most thought-provoking part of my life, most important. But I'm a nurse. My background's in nursing. So I was a district nurse for a number of years working in the community, and I've worked in various different research roles, both in academic and clinical research, but also in workforce for probably what is now the majority of my career, actually, in various leadership roles. And for some of my week, I am the primary care development lead, which is a very long-winded title that probably means nothing, which means I am basically in a senior leadership role within primary care in North Cumbria, working in the northeast and North Cumbria NHS Integrated Care Board. All those acronyms I need to read out so that people know what they actually mean. But I also do freelance training. And one of the reasons I'm here to speak to you today is because last year I completed my PhD in professional identity, looking at integration. And really what happened was I had the opportunity to do a PhD. I was a project manager of a large research study looking at integration and all these mixed professional teams coming together and performing these, what we now call neighbourhood teams or integrated teams, or however you ever might want to describe them. And I had the opportunity to study, and I was kind of given free rein as to what I wanted to do. And I was really fascinated as to how people felt about themselves within their own profession when they were moved into these very kind of overt integrated teams, so more than a multidisciplinary team. And I was like, these people have been working in relative silos in their professions. What happens to them when they move into these mixed teams? And this is the thing that really fascinates me, is what is our professional identity and what happens to us when we move into these mixed teams? And often what we'll see is we'll see this kind of stuff happening around us. We'll feel it ourselves. We'll see it in the teams that we lead. But it's just trying to get underneath it all and think, well, what is the interactions? What's happening? How do people feel? And how does this impact us in our roles? And really when you start to think about recruitment and retention of staff, people feeling like they're really secure within their roles, actually, what role does professional identity play? And what do we need to consider when we think about ourselves in a mixed professional environment? So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today, using my research, using research, other published research out there, using a little bit of theory and also some experience. And what I'll do is I'll encourage you to really sort of reflect yourself about what this means to you. So we're just going to have a quick overview of professional identity, about what it is, why it's important, understanding how we identify in groups, and what does this mean for us in a professional role. Start to think about mixed professional environments, integration, however you want to term that, and the impact that can have on us and our impact on our professional identity. And then start to think about, okay, well, how do we have a positive professional identity? And when we think about the world in which we all work now, where we work across multiple disciplines, multiple teams, organizations, systems, actually, how do we maintain a positive professional identity and have teams that work well together because we feel like we belong and we feel like we have psychological safety? So a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but that's what we're going to be discussing. And I'm going to encourage you and prompt you to individually reflect. So we don't have a lot of time to do lots of discussion this morning, but what I will do is I'll be questioning you, getting you to think, what does this mean to me? Because what I find is that if you can consider it for yourself and really reflect, then it really helps you understand the wider context. And then obviously within the roles in which we're all in, then think about the teams that we're leading, think about the people that we influence and the people that we impact. Actually, what does this mean for them? Okay, so without further ado, what's identity? We talk about identity all the time. It's very commonly spoken about. We talk about it a lot more now. It's a really positive thing to really think about. What is our identity? What is our sense of self? It's that question. If you're asking yourself now, who am I? How would you describe yourself? It's kind of an interesting thing to think about. Maybe it's something you don't often think about. Some people do more than others for lots of different reasons. Lots of different things will motivate them to really think about their identity. For others of us, we may not think about it quite so much, but it's that sense of who am I? What does that mean? And often we will describe ourselves in a couple of different ways. Something very personal to us. So psychologists really tend to focus on our personal formation of identity, what it means to us. Sociologists tend to think about ourselves and our identity in relation to other people, relation to groups. So often when we talk about who am I, so I might describe myself as a mum, but that's my role, that's who I am. But by doing that, I'm automatically placing myself in a group of other mums and in parents, and so it goes on. And actually, as humans, we're really sociable. We like to feel part of a group. We like to feel like we belong. And actually what we do is we place ourselves within groups. Even though it's a very deeply personal and individual thing to us, actually what we're often doing is placing ourselves with other people who are similar to us, who feel like they have a similar experience or have similar roles to us. So that's our identity. Then when you think about your professional identity, it's a very similar questioning. It's a very similar thought process. It's that same question, who am I? Who am I in a professional setting? So it's interesting. How do you describe yourself? It's an interesting thing just to take a second or two and think about. Because if I say to myself, okay, let's take the main role that I do in a week, primary care development lead. What on earth does that mean? It's a long title that's fairly meaningless, to be honest. So if you ask me who am I in a professional setting, I'll still go back and say I'm a nurse. Now I haven't done front-facing, clinical-facing roles for a long while, but I feel like a nurse. I have my registration, and I still very strongly feel like a nurse. That for me is my strongest professional identity. And this might be something that some of you can reflect and actually relate to, is actually, what is your identity? Did you start off with a professional training at the beginning of your career? Have you moved around? Have you grown into the career that you're doing? Have you grown into the role? When you ask yourself that question, who am I? What do you say? Who do you identify with? Where do you feel that place of belonging is? And what we understand about professional identity is it's built up through workplace cultures. It's that socializing with other people within the same role or the same team or the same organization, wherever it is that you feel that you fit, that as you socialize with them, there's something about knowledge and skills. There's something about learning to do that thing that you do. But then there's something much deeper. There's something about the ethics of the role, the ethics of the profession, the values that you share, and then the behaviors that you start to have. And actually what you realize is that you start to learn them within a profession. You start to learn them within a team or within an organization. And they have this thing called accepted ways of knowing. So it's almost that thing that you know because you're part of that profession, those things that you share. So much of that is about experience. And you learn to be part of that profession. Now, what's really clear is that it's easier to identify when you're part of a recognized profession. So I can go back to nursing. Whether you understand nursing fully or not, everyone pretty much knows who a nurse is. It's a recognized profession. It's easy for me to say, but I go back and identify with that. When you work in a slightly less well-known profession, or a profession that's less easy to define, or a team that's less easy to define, sometimes that can be harder to think, well, how do I identify? Do I identify with the people who share the same values with me in my team? Is that something we can define as a professional or not? But it's about, who am I in a professional setting? I think it's a really simple question, and I think it's definitely something that's worth reflecting on, because it's that place that you go back to that you feel like you belong. So we often learn to be part of a profession right early on. Our professional identity occurs in when we start to learn to be part of that thing that we identify with, that profession, that role. We, like I said, we learn those knowledge and skills. We learn how to do the profession. We undertake the role. We start to feel more comfortable doing the things that you do as part of that role or that profession. And as part of that, you start to learn a shared language, or you start to use words. So, for example, I will often refer to the patient. You might refer to the service user. I was having a conversation with someone this morning who referred to the customer. There are certain words that you share and you use within a role and within a profession, and actually they become known to you. And it's almost like a currency that you use, that you share between yourselves, and it makes sense. But actually, professional identity is a very social activity. It's a very social process. We don't just reflect, but we do something called reflexivity, which is where we actually consider ourselves within that reflection. And within that socialization, within that participating in those things that you do in that professional culture, with sharing the experiences that you feel a sense of belonging. There's something there that's familiar to you. It makes sense to you. Those other people make sense to you because they understand and they share the experiences that you have. So think of yourself in a scenario where you go to a conference, for example, and it's a mixed professional conference. How many times in those scenarios do you find those other people that are the same as you? So I'll go there and I'm like, oh, you're a nurse. Oh, and there's an instant connection. There's something. We may work in entirely different parts of nursing, but there's a connection there. How many times has that happened to you where you've been in a mixed professional environment and you instantly click with the people who identify similar to what you do? Because of that thing that you share in that social activity, that social acknowledgement that you're part of a group. So social identity theory is really interesting. It tells us that what we do is that we identify as groups. It's fairly simple, to be honest. What it says is that we have our self is socially constructed, and effectively we have an in-group and out-groups. So our in-groups are the people that are the same as us. So I describe myself as a mum. Some of you on this call will be mums. Some of you will be parents. Some of you might be nurses, I don't know. But there'll be things that we share. We're part of the same group. We understand each other. There'll be experiences that we've gone through and things that we've done. There'll be knowledge that we'll have gained, that we understand each other and have that recognition, and we will feel a sense of connection. The people who aren't part of that group will feel slightly different. There'll be a connection that we don't have in quite the same way, and that's described as the out group. But what we know is because as humans, we need that social connection so much. Our self-esteem is very strongly affected by our fit. So our fit to the in-group, as in we need to feel connected to the in-group. We need to feel connected to that group with people who are the same as us, because actually we need to feel like we fit in. We need to feel secure. We need to feel safe. So in a professional setting, we need to have that in-group. We need to have that group of people that feel that we share those experiences, we share that culture, we share that knowledge, we share whatever it is, but we feel like we understand and get each other. So social identity tells us that we have a personal identity, and then it talks here about a social identity, but that's actually also a professional identity. And we gain that professional identity. Let's use that as the example. We gain that through categorization. Because what we do, without even sometimes realizing it, is we acknowledge the people who are the same as us and the people who are different to us. So we acknowledge the people who come from the same group as us. Oh, you're a nurse too. Oh, cool, excellent. And off you go, and you recognize that thing. Oh, you do the same job as me. We do the same role. Or oh, you're a mum too. Oh, yeah, it's a nightmare, isn't it? All that kind of stuff. Those moments, either socially or professionally, where you meet people who are from the same group. And being part of that group, you then gain that sense of security. It's that safe space, because actually you recognize that you have similar experiences, similar knowledge, similar language, similar culture in a professional setting, similar ethics, similar behaviors. It makes sense to you. But by forming that in-group, what you're also doing is you're recognizing the people that don't form part of that group. You're recognizing the people that aren't part of it. Now, in no way does that mean you discriminate against the out group. It doesn't mean that I think any less of any other profession. What it means is I recognize I just don't understand them in the same way. I might have a respect and think, really respect what they can bring, but I don't understand. I'm not part of that group. If I walked into their team meeting or I walked into their professional training, I would feel pretty out of place because there'd be so much I wouldn't understand. Okay, so it's about that in-group and that out-group. And obviously, if you start to think about socially, in groups and out groups taken to the extreme, lead to some really, really negative things. You think about, racial discrimination, you think about war, you think about gang warfare in cities. You think about gang warfare. Actually, it's all about this in-group and the out-group, isn't it? But it's taken to the absolute extreme. But what we realize is that in everyday life, actually, we have these in-groups and these out-groups. And professionally, it's about recognizing who's my in-group, who are the people that are similar to me, who are the people that I identify with, because there's something that we share. Okay. And in a professional setting, our professions are often our in-groups. And like I say, if you don't come from a defined profession, or you train in a defined profession early on in your career, that professional identity might be a little bit harder to understand, might take a little bit more reflection. But that place that we think is our in-group, that's our safe space. They're the people that get us, we understand each other. Okay, but your professional identity does need to be maintained. We need connection with our in-group. So in the same way that we form our professional identity through connecting with people and talking and socializing, we need to keep that socialization. We need to keep that connection. And that's what I'm going to go on to talk about in just a second, is what happens when we don't quite have it like that. Okay, now identity can change, it can flex. It will change throughout our careers. So I started off as a nurse in a patient-facing role. I'm not doing that now. I went in an entirely different role. I now identify quite a lot with with leadership and management. But actually what we need to think about is, what is happening to my identity? Who do I identify with? What's my strongest identity? Where do I feel safe? Where do I feel secure? So I'd ask you to ask yourselves those questions. Who am I in a work context? In a professional context, what is my professional identity? Who is my in-group? Where are the places that I feel safe? Who are the people that feel understand me and get me because we share something? And really critically, do you have time and space to connect with your in-group? Because your professional identity is social. You need that sociability. How are you getting it? And when are you getting it? And I think that's a really good consideration for us all to have, not just for ourselves, but for the teams that we lead as well. So why does professional identity matter? Why am I even talking to you about it? We've talked about this sense of belonging. It creates familiarity, it's security, it's known. With that, it gives us a confidence in our roles. It really affects our self-esteem. It really supports positive self-esteem. And then from that, it really supports psychological safety at work. So it's incredible.
Through the head.
Oh, someone popped in there. So that psychological safety at work, that sense of belonging, that sense that I feel safe, I feel secure, this is familiar, I have a positive self-esteem. You think of the impact that has on retention of staff. So if you've got staff groups who don't have that psychological safety, who don't have that self-esteem, that confidence, that familiarity and that security, what's going to happen to them? Probably going to move on to something else. Or you're looking at, scenarios where people aren't going to be working to the best of their abilities. So that psychologically safe workspace starts with a sense of belonging. And sense of belonging is all about, what is my identity? Who am I in a professional context? Who's my in-group? And how can I have that connection with my in-group? So professional identity is extremely important. It's something that we probably take for granted to some extent because it just happens, but it can be really good to stop and reflect and think to ourselves, what is it? How am I connecting with those other people that are the same as me, that place where I belong? Because actually that's really important. So then when we start to think about multidisciplinary teams, teams working with different sectors, and start mixing up the professionals like we work every single day, what impact can that then have on our professional identity? So what we know is that often we split up peer groups. So often we create smaller peer groups when we move people into multi-professional teams. That obviously then impacts on our social connection. So our ability to connect within that safe space where we feel safe and we feel like we belong is then impacted. And obviously that then impacts on our ability to turn our identity, that thing that's so important to us. And we can end up with professionally isolated members of staff. And I've seen that in teams where we create these teams where one person comes in with some sort of specialism or some kind of interest, which is so desperately needed. But actually, if they then don't have that connection to the people who are the same as them, then they start to feel quite isolated. They start to feel quite insecure. And that's what I'm going to talk about now. What can happen when we start to create multi-professional teams? So I'm just going to run through this really quickly, but what can happen is we can feel quite threatened. So often because of a lack of peers, a lack of people doing the same role as us, a lack of people who have the same identity as us, we lose that sense of familiarity and security that professional identity can give us. And often what we can have is a fear of almost, I'm being turned into a generic profession. I'm losing that thing that I identify as. So I went into this role, I went into this profession for a reason. There was something about it that drew me, something that was interesting to me, something that I wanted to do. And I'm now being moved into this multi-professional world where I don't have that connection with those people who feel the same as me. Actually, I feel like I'm losing my edges, the thing about me that's different. And there's this term called creeping genericism. And there's a reference at the end. It's by Brian Crawford and Darren Camus, and they did this work and they describe this term, creeping genericism, which I think is brilliant. And what it describes is this fear that we're being turned into generic roles. We're being made generic. And it isn't a one-stop, here we are, you're all one profession now, but it's gradually losing that edge. It's like almost like a drip, 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 a creeping thing. I'm being asked to change this little bit, or this little bit's changing, or I'm starting to pick up something else from another role, or someone else is starting to pick up something that I used to do. And actually we feel like edges are being eroded. And it's a fear that we're being made into generic professions. So that in-group identity that's so important to us, we feel like we're losing it and we're slowly being eroded away, and it creates quite a threat. And one of my research participants said, right, I just worry that we're going to end up as a jack of all trades, master of none. And it's something you hear quite a lot. I'm having to pick up everything, or they're picking up something I did, and actually I'm losing that thing that's so important to me, that specialism that I hold. So these are threats that we can feel. And as a result of these threats, we can become quite defensive and we can become quite insecure. And we won't always feel like this, but these might be things that you can recognize either at various points in your own career or your own experience, or you might recognize them in other people. So that very defensive approach, that feeling like other people don't understand me. They don't understand what it is I bring, this special thing about my role, about my profession that's different to everyone else's. Other people don't understand me. So a really good example of that was when I was doing my research with some therapists. So therapist's role was to go out to people's houses, assess them, and then come back and spend quite a long amount of time sitting in front of a computer doing various assessments and referrals, etc., etc. And they were working in an office where nurses would walk past every day, and the nurses were really busy and they were bustling in and out, and you could see them rushing and rushing around physically in and out all day long. And the therapist said, the nurses don't understand I'm busy. They see I'm sitting here with at my computer with a cup of tea and they think I'm doing nothing. They don't understand my role. They don't understand that this is a vital part of my role. And actually the nurses never did say that about the therapist, but that's how the therapists feel. And what we've found is that people often feel like other professions or other teams or other organizations don't understand their role, don't understand their professional identity. And it leads us to being quite defensive. Because what happens when we don't feel understood? We go out of our way to explain ourselves, don't we? We go out of our way to emphasize that thing that I bring. I bring this to this. This is this unique thing that I bring. No one else can bring this because this comes from my profession. Because we're feeling, again, we're kind of becoming quite entrenched within our professional identity and almost, really feeling like this need to defend it, this need to protect the role that we have, because we're fighting against that creeping genericism. We're fighting against losing the edges because actually I don't feel like they understand what I bring. They don't understand what I'm bringing to the team. And it can make us quite insecure. So it's often made worse when we've got smaller peer groups because we've got less ability to socialize within those people that are the same as us. It can change dynamics, especially if there's a lot of change. I'm going through a lot of change. All the ICBs in the country going through a lot of change at the minute, leaving people very, very insecure. Change we didn't choose. No one chose for this to happen. And then there's this fear that my role is going to be lost altogether. What happens if they take my role out? What happens if my role's not needed anymore? What happens if they keep taking away from my role the things that other people can do? And then I feel actually my role doesn't even exist anymore. And about 6 years ago, a district nurse said to me, I truly believe in the next 5 years, the district nurse will disappear. Well, the district nurse still hasn't disappeared 6, 7 years later, but that is how she felt. And I have had the similar comment from another nurse, feeling like all these other new roles are coming in and the nurse is going to disappear. Now you might say, well, that's such a fundamental, it's a large profession, it's so unlikely to disappear. But this is how insecure these people were feeling by the changes that had happened to them. And if we feel threatened in a multi-professional team, we can become quite defensive and we can become quite insecure. So you think of all the aims that we're trying to achieve to get people to work together in a multi-professional environment. If you've got people that are defensive and people that are insecure, you're unlikely to be able to achieve what you're wanting to achieve. So it's really, really important that we think about it and we understand why it's happening. As a result of those threats, what we end up doing is we often end up employing tactics. We'll do tactical things to try and preserve our professional identity, because our professional identity, that question of who am I, is really, really important to us, because that's our safe space. That's what we chose to go into. That's the place where we feel like we belong. So we're going to protect it, aren't we? Because it's something really important to us. So often what people will do is they'll go out of their way to prove how their profession is unique and different. So you're trying to prove what it is you bring to the team, emphasizing those skills and them specialisms. Talk about, well, I'm in the team because of this, and this is what I can bring, and my profession is this, and this is what's unique and different. And another really interesting thing people often do is talk a lot about how busy they are. Now, I would imagine we are all very busy. I don't think there's anyone that works in any public sector organisation that's not busy. I think that those days are long gone if they ever existed in the first place. But actually, why are we talking about how busy we are? So if I constantly emphasize to you that I'm really, really busy, what am I trying to prove? I'm trying to prove you need me in this team. There's something about my skills, there's something about my profession, there's something about my role that's really unique and it's really different, and you need me. And you can tell you need me because I'm really busy. So if you get someone who's constantly overemphasizing how busy they are, sometimes it's about looking beneath the surface and thinking, okay, is there a little bit of defensiveness? Is there a little bit of insecurity that's creeping in here? Why are they feeling that they need to constantly emphasize how busy they are? So we've talked about professional identity, what it is, why it's important. We've talked about what can happen if we put people in a multi-professional environment, which is effectively how most of us work now. So bearing in mind the world in which we live and the fact that, working in a multi-professional way is the way forward, and we know for all manner of reasons why that's such a positive and the right thing to do, how do we help people feel secure? How do we help people function in multi-professional teams where they still feel that they belong, where they still feel that they're actually they're part of the group, where we can improve staff retention because they feel psychologically safe and they feel that they belong in that group? And that is the question, because actually we need to move not in individuals together forward, but we need teams to move forward together as well. So what we're starting to understand is that we need to have a positive professional identity. So if you start to look at some of the things that can go wrong or some of the things that can threaten us in a multi-professional environment, then let's start to think about, okay, what's the flip side of that then? So if we feel like this, then what do we need to do to stop feeling like that? And these are almost like the pillars of a positive professional identity. This is what I'm starting to understand, is that these are the things that we need to try and put in place to make sure that on an individual level, people have a positive professional identity. And we can expand this and we can start to think about this in a team setting as well. So it's about making sure people feel valued. It's really good to reflect on this yourself and think to yourself, well, do I feel valued? Do I feel valued in my team? Do I feel valued for the role that I have? I identify, when you ask me the question, who am I in a professional setting? I say, I am this. Okay, do I feel valued for that within my team? Think about the teams that you lead. Do they feel valued? Do they feel valued for the role that they bring, for the profession that they bring? It's not just thinking, yeah, I value them. The question is, do they feel valued? Do they feel understood? Now, I can say, I understand what your role is, and I could rattle off a few things that might be right or might not be. Doesn't mean you feel understood. Doesn't mean I've got it right. Doesn't mean that deep down you really feel understood for the role that you deliver. And that's the really key question here is, do you feel understood? Because if you don't feel understood, what you're going to do is you're going to you'll feel defensive probably, and you will probably go out of your way to constantly explain what you do. And it puts barriers up. It makes you feel defensive because you're defending your role. It's important to you. It's your professional identity. It's your safe space. You went into that role for a reason. You chose that role. And therefore you want to defend it. You want to feel understood. So are people feeling understood? If they're not, think, what do I need to do? What do we need to put in place? How do we promote understanding? How do we actually put structures and things in place and provision in place to ensure that there is true understanding? How can we use that for training and development? How can we use that not just to train and develop the rest of the team, but actually to help the people who are delivering the training to really feel understood themselves? What difference is that going to make to them? Think about expertise and specialisms. Do you feel like your expertise and the specialisms and the experience that you've grown throughout your career, is it being used? Do you feel that actually I could use something a lot more? Do you feel it's used within the teams in which you lead? That unique contribution. So when you bring a multi-professional team together, each one of them will have a unique contribution. There's something unique. So the flip side of creeping genericism is the fact that every profession, every role is there uniquely. So what is that unique contribution? Is that being used? And critically, is there peer connection? Because if there isn't peer connection, if you think about professional identity being social, you think about the fact that we get it through interacting with other people that are the same as us, and we recognize people that are the same as us, and we feel safe with them because we share something. If we don't have peer connection, it's going to really disrupt our professional identity. It's going to disrupt our sense of psychological safety, our sense of belonging. And likely we'll move on. So you think about staff retention, it's huge. You really need that peer connection. So if you can't get it within your team, where are you going to get it outside of your team? And it's all about balance. Now, I don't think there's ever a workplace where you can get rid of all the threats. I think it's absolutely impossible. The world's changing. There's no such thing as a perfect workplace. Threats will always exist. There will always be times when you feel like your role or your skills isn't being used properly. You feel like you've got less of a peer connection than you want. It might just be that your team's been, or your professionals around you have been reduced. You don't feel understood. It happens all the time. But the key thing here is thinking about balance. So think, how can I make sure I feel valued? What can I do to make sure I have a positive professional identity? What changes can I make? So if I don't have enough people within my immediate team who identify the same as I do, how do I get that connection? Where else do I go? What other professional networks do I need to be part of? As a leader, what other professional networks do you need to enable? Think about leadership within professions. How are you growing and strengthening leadership within professions, within teams, within services, within organizations? Think about that connection. Think about how people identify. Think about, where is their safe space? Where do they need to see that leadership? How do I enable them to have that peer connection? Think about feeling understood. If I don't feel understood, what do I need to do to feel understood? What differences have I got to make? If I don't feel my specialisms and my expertise are being well used, how can I change that? What can I do? How can I make sure that my unique role is being recognized? Because if I feel that, my balance will tip and I will feel more valued. I will feel more secure. I will feel less defensive. And you think about that. Think of that, if trying to create that positive balance. If I feel more secure, if I feel less defensive, if I feel like I've got connection, I'm much more likely to work in a multi-professional environment in a more positive way. I'm much more likely to be open to innovate, open to work with other professions, open to try new things. And our professional identity is not static. It will change throughout our career. I'm sure many of you now, and you reflect on your professional identity, can think, well, I do identify as that, but it did change a bit. And I've got a little bit of an identity there, but that one's probably my most important one. But it has changed and it will change. But our important identities do need to be nurtured and do need to be sustained, because if they don't, we won't feel safe. We won't feel like we belong. We won't feel secure. And it will change in different circumstances, and it will be impacted by different groups, different influences. And I'm sure if you sit and think about it, you can consider what that might be and how it's happened to you. So if you can reflect on it on yourself, think about the teams in which you're leading. And here's the key bit going forward. So we work in integrated ways. We work in multi-professional teams. We work across sectors. So how do we help people have a professional identity that helps them in those environments? So if you look at the little, very highly scientific bubble on the left-hand side, you've got your main identity there, your professional group identity. That question I asked you right at the beginning, who am I? I said, I'm a nurse, right? That's my main professional identity. I've got other bits and pieces, but that's my main professional identity. What we now are starting to understand is that if that identity is secure, and if you feel safe within it, and you feel like it's supported, there is the opportunity then to create a second identity with your multi-professional team. This is the key thing here I want you to remember. If your first identity is secure and positive, you can then start to create a multi-professional identity. But it will only happen if you feel secure. And it will only happen if your main professional identity is recognized and nurtured. And so often when we move into multi-professional environments, we go from starting place to multi-professional team, off you go, run, deliver. And what we're not remembering is that we have brought together disparate parts. And we should not, and this is the key thing, another thing, don't forget anything else. We're trying to create a fruit salad, not a smoothie. Okay? This, someone else told me this, so I can't even, claim the fame for this one. But you know what? We're bringing together disparate parts. Everything comes together, it works well, it creates a flavor, it delivers what we want it to deliver. We are not trying to mash it all up and create something new. And this is the thing I want you to remember for mixed professional teams. You're wanting a fruit salad, not a smoothie. And to have a fruit salad, each of those pieces of fruit, they retain who they are. They retain their flavor, they retain their color, they retain their shape, but they work well together. And that's what we're trying to do in professions. And I think so often we try and create smoothies, or people are afraid that we're trying to create smoothies because we haven't addressed all these other factors. And that's the thing that's really key. So to flourish in your role, we need to acknowledge and celebrate our differences. And it feels like a bit of an elephant in the room, but I keep putting it out there. We are different. We came into different roles. We have different specialisms. We have different unique contributions. We need to acknowledge and celebrate those. We need to facilitate understanding of our own roles and other roles. So think about the teams that you lead. Think about the other people that you work with. How do you really facilitate that understanding? And how do you create opportunities for professional peer support? Time where you can go and you can feel understood and you can share experiences and you feel safe. Yeah, it's like going back to that place where you feel secure. And a positive professional identity is when we feel safe, we feel connected, and we feel a sense of belonging. And it's really, really important. So just remember, your professional identity is really important for your well-being at work. It's really important for staff retention. Professional peer support is critical to support our professional identity. We need to go back to a place where we feel like we belong, where we feel like we're safe, where people just get us. They're our in-group. And acknowledging differences does not stop us from forming a new team identity. I actually think it's the founding stone, the keystone to it. We need to acknowledge the different things about us and realize that we come together and we slot together and we can work well together. If you start eroding those edges, creating that creeping genericism, taking away that safe space where people feel like they belong, you can forget having a functioning team because all you'll get is defensiveness and insecurity. So we need to appreciate the unique qualities that each profession brings. So I want you to consider, what changes do you need to make to support your own professional identity? And what might you need to do to support the professional identity of your team and your colleagues? So any questions? And I'm very happy for anyone to contact me as well. I do some training and bits and pieces, so I'm very happy to have a conversation with anybody. And I have got another slide which has some references on it, which I will share for you all to have. So I hope it's been useful. I'm very happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Fiona. We have got there's a couple of comments in there. I was wondering about when you first started talking about professional identity and whether there was some potential overlaps with equality, diversity, inclusion work that we maybe do. So there might be some overlaps there. One interesting point that Rachel Morris has raised is saying wonders whether it resonates with people who've got strong professional identities who are promoted to management leadership roles, and whether the fact that those those leadership roles are not necessarily recognised as a profession in their own right, and whether that should be applied to some of our learning development programs, or vice versa, whether the professional identity should still be retained in the professional, the leadership management position. Just wonder if you got a thought on that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. I think it's a few ways of looking at this actually, because actually, if you're managed by someone who's from a different profession as you, do you really feel like you've got that understanding? So I think, you know, in the scenario where we've got somebody with a very strong professional identity managing a multi-professional team, how do they truly connect with the people that are from a different profession? I think you can on some levels for sure. But I think again, it's about being very honest and saying, actually, the people within my team also need a professional connection to people within their same profession. So again, when you start to think about it on an organizational level, how do we ensure that there's true leadership within professions so that people can always connect within their own profession? I think there's something also, a professional identity within leadership, really interesting, isn't it? Because when we come into leadership and management roles, we come from every which direction. You know, we've probably got, or a lot of us already got a professional identity somewhere else, but is our leadership and our management role almost a second identity? And we then start to create another one. So I would feel like I actually really identify with a lot of people with doing similar roles to me who have come from all sorts of different directions, but we identify and we feel safe and we can connect together on the leadership and management level. So again, it's about, you know, that peer connection. So you think about, you know, people move into a leadership role often because they move up a banding or they get promotion, and we expect them to suddenly lead. You know, that whole coaching network, that think about, you know, having that safe space to go to lead you within your role. Again, it's about creating that peer connection, isn't it? So there's lots of which ways we can actually dissect this. But I think it's about each of us probably having that space to connect and go and reflect and think, right, who am I? Who do I connect with? Who do I need to connect with? Where are the safe spaces I need to go back to within the role in which I'm doing? And as leaders and managers, how do we facilitate that? But interesting comment also about the inclusion and diversity is that actually I'm speaking at a conference in the ICB across the Northeast and Yorkshire next month about that, because exactly right, you know, it's about inclusion from lots of different angles, isn't it? And how do we feel included and how do we ensure that we have diversity, but how do we feel that there's equality? And I think an interesting conversation is parity of profession. So across all the different sectors, you'll have some professions that possibly have more dominance than another. How do you create that true inclusion and equalities? It's an interesting debate.
Yeah. One of the thoughts that occurred to me while you was talking, actually it became a little bit of a sales pitch for the PPMA, because you talk about professional identity, people that may be in multiple multifunction teams, they've always got the opportunity to sort of come back to the PPMA family, sort of connect with others so it can retain their professional identity, so that they can support them in retaining that professional identity going forward. Anyway, that's a different thought. I'm sure
There we are, something to think about.
Gordon's clapping there. Of course he would be, yeah. But I think we've got another minute. I can't see if there's any other questions, to be honest, but really interesting session, Fiona. So thank you very much. It's quite thought-provoking, actually. Just occurred to me, and you did give some solutions there for the in terms of people coming into multifunctional sort of teams. Occurred to me that with your fruit salad analogy, the syrup, if you like, that helps to sort of bind that, or custard will help to maybe make it, gel it all together and bring it all together. To me, I was thinking, well, is that in itself the project or the work that you're trying to do together as a team? You could say that becomes the glue that helps bind you together to sort of form a different kind of sense of identity in terms of the work that you're doing. Anyway, different thought there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it depends what the deliverable is, whether you're working around a customer, a service user, a patient, a team of people, a team of staff, an organization. Like, what is the end goal? What is the aims and objectives of your team? Why are you in that team together? And you're right, that's almost like the gel that comes in together. But what you're trying to go is you're going to get to a place where you feel like those other people are part of my us, a part of my in-group. They're not different to me, but actually we're in this together because of that gel, that aims and objectives, whatever it might be.
Okay, well, that's brings us nicely to the end of the session. So thank you very, very much for that. That's
Thank you.
really good, and there's quite a few people have been putting comments in, thinking it's a really good session. So thank you, Fiona.